good morning, everybody. I'm Adam Tempest. I'm a Senior Research Officer in the Longitudinal Study Development Team. I've worked with the LS for about 4.5 years so far, most recently on our linkage of 2021 census data to the study. So the award, the Research Excellence Award was given to Celsius for their fantastic work, providing the user support function that enables academic access to the LS via the SRS. Stephen, I'm sure, will talk a lot more about that later. But my role in this presentation will hopefully be to provide you with some background information about what the LS is and what it can do, and showcase to you how powerful and useful it is. Hopefully, throughout both of our presentations, you'll be keeping in mind whether the LS could be a useful resource for your own work potentially. So initially, what is the ONS Longitudinal Study? So it's a study, not a survey, of linked census and life events data on a 1% sample of the population of England and Wales. We don't send out questionnaires or anything like that. Our study makes use of secondary data, whether it's census data or life events, that are compiled and linked for just 1% of the population. We cover England and Wales, but we do have sister studies, the NILS and the SLS, that do similar work, that have a similar longitudinal study for Northern Ireland and Scotland. The LS was set up in the 1970s, the early 70s, initially conceived of to provide better data on inequalities and mortality and life expectancy, particularly with a focus on occupation and social class. So that was the initial aim, but since then, especially with the addition of more and more census information, the potential use of the longitudinal study has grown massively. So while the longitudinal study was created and conceived in the early 70s, the idea of a longitudinal study like this has been around for centuries. There's an excellent quote here. I won't read it all out, but from an epidemiologist called William Farr, talking about how useful and interesting it would be to take a sample of 400,000 or 500,000 people randomly from the population and trace their lives from birth, highlighting key events in their lives, to study the mortality, to study all sorts of things really. Yeah. So the thought has been there on the usefulness for a very long time, and the study here has been around for a very long time. And the good thing about the LS is that the more time passes, the more useful the data becomes. So the first sample was drawn from the 1971 census, and samples have subsequently been drawn from every census since. So we've now got 6 time points of data from the censuses for this 1% sample of the population. So the sample is drawn randomly based on one of 4 birth dates. If you have one of those birth dates, you're a member of the longitudinal study. These birth dates are kept under strict control. Only those that have essential requirement to see them will see them. It's locked down pretty much to the LS development team. Even members of Celsius wouldn't have access to them. This is to protect the identity of our LS members, since they do not know that they are part of this study. Similar controls are kept in place for users and researchers of the data. So there are requirements like a researcher wouldn't have access to geography information directly below local authority level. They wouldn't have access to anything more than like a date of birth year or age. just to minimize the chances of any of our members and the birth dates being identified. So from each of the censuses, we compile the full census records for each of these members, and these are linked to the individual through the MIDAS system, which is a system that's run by NHS Digital, which uses some personal information to link that individual over time. And this is just done for members, but to provide more contextual information as well at each census point, we include information on the co-residence of that member in their household. So this would just be for households rather than communal establishments. But that can give an insight into the people that our members are living with at different time points in their lives. In addition to the census information, we also trace our members to different life events information. So births, deaths, immigration, widowhoods, cancer registrations, all of that kind of thing are linked annually. I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. Just 1 second. So for each of our LS members and their co-residents, we capture the complete census record. And every census, you have the basic demographic information like age, sex, marital status, country of birth, etc., that are there on the left side of your screen. We also capture the information that's only included at some censuses. So in 1971, for example, there were questions relating to the parental country of birth and fertility history, which are included if our members were present in 1971. And since 1991, more and more questions have been added to the census data. And so that is adding to our picture of our members to provide a greater kind of more complete picture of who they are. And it also allows more interesting and varied research to be conducted. So since 1991, we have information on ethnicity and limiting long-term illness, self-reported health as well since 2001. Interestingly, now that we have linked on the 2021 census data, it provides longitudinal insights into how things like national identity and main language changes. So if potentially some of our members have immigrated and or identify as a particular national identity, does a decade's time passing change how they might identify themselves, or also change how like the main language that they use to communicate. And yeah, obviously in 2021 we've got more questions as well relating to sexual orientation and veteran status. On the life events side, we collect information from the ONS's life events data repository. So these can be cohort defining, so we can add new members to our sample if they are new births with an LS birth date. They can leave the sample if they are members that have died with an LS birth date. And it can also add some more interesting, colourful information to that individual, looking at, for example, birth sample mothers. So we'll go through that new births file again and find cases where one of our members has had a baby, and we can flag that and include that in a separate table of the longitudinal study. And similarly, through the deaths file again, to find cases where an LS member has been widowed. The cancer registry information is also linked onto the longitudinal study, so you'll be able to identify whether one of our members has been diagnosed with cancer, what type of cancer, and that kind of thing. Currently, this data goes up to 2015 because of some data governance reasons that had to cease. But as part of our next step, now that Census 2021 linkage is complete, our LS Futures project is looking at restarting that supply and bringing that particular table up to date. We also take some information on live events from the NHS registration systems. So any new non-birth NHS registration where the individual has an LS birth date, they're added to the sample as well. And we also have information on, we call them minor events, but this is things like immigration, embarkations, re-entries, and enlistments. So this is where the NHS personal demographic service, I suppose, that's what you might recognize it as, would flag someone with an LS birth date as having, for example, joined the PDS, whereas where they haven't been there before, that will be flagged as a new entrant or as an immigration. And similarly, we can use flags that are on that particular database for reasons for removal to flag embarkations, entries and enlistments as well. Okie doke. So to try and illustrate this a bit more clearly for you potentially, we've got all this data, but how does it relate to a member? So we have a hypothetical female LS member here. They were born in 1955, but their first interaction with the longitudinal study would be their entry on the 1971 census. Probably still living at home with their parents. So within this census record, we'll be able to capture their data too, and any other co-resident siblings, for example. Between the 1971 and 1981 census, they had a baby. They were present on 1981, and then obviously then as well, data will be captured on their co-residents, potentially a husband and the small child as well. There's another baby in between the 1981 and 1991 census, and then we had a flag on the NHS record as an embarkation flag to say that that individual has moved abroad between the 1981 and 1991 census. So we wouldn't have a 91 census record for her, but when she returned from abroad, we would flag that as a re-entry from the NHS system. They'd be present in the 2001 census, along with any co-residents. They could have a widowhood event, so a husband could have died between 2001 and 2011, appear on the cancer registry, presence in 2011, and then unfortunately died in 2019. But that can highlight how each LS member could have their own unique combination of events, and how the LS could capture that and capture that through their life. The LS is the largest longitudinal data source in England and Wales by quite some distance, considering sample size. For each pair of censuses, there's more than 400,000 records, a third of a million for 3 censuses, and so on. And we have data now from 6 consecutive censuses where we have 157,000 members that are present on all 6 of those censuses. In total, this would reflect 1.3 million members that are present in their own combination of appearances in different censuses, whether it's just one or many consecutively or not. Having such a large sample size means that it provides a data set that's quite robust for researchers that are interested in some specific things. We've had researchers looking at groups with particular ethnicities or countries of birth, groups of people with certain types of occupations and things like that. And the sample size enables that breakdown to be done and conclusions still to be made with significant and sufficient power. It also enables breakdowns, as I said earlier, at a local authority level, so you can investigate local change in that sense. So what can the LS be used for? This is an example of work that has been done at the ONS as a national statistic, looking at life expectancy by socioeconomic position. So this is a table that we've taken from this that shows the trends for men since 1982, with life expectancy improving, which is good for all social classes, which is good. But there is a clear pattern across the socioeconomic classification that class 1 has the highest life expectancy, class 2 has the second highest, and this continues and has continued since 1982. Well, unfortunately, the gap between the classes 1 and 7 has grown since 1982, which suggests, which shows that there's a greater disparity in life expectancy depending on your socioeconomic class. So this product was last updated for the time period 2012 to 2016, and work is underway now that we have our updated life events and census data on adding that next 5-year time point to this graph, to this product. But it's not just mortality that the LS can be used for. These are the projects that were using the 2021 census data for as part of our beta testing of the new database, of the updated database. So while better mortality was the original goal, over time it's been used to address more and more different social research topics. The research for our beta test projects has included research on migration, ethnicity, national identity, language use, travel to work, internal migration, health inequalities, social mobility, and housing. So there's such a huge variety of different topics that you could be using the LS for, which is fascinating. Anything that's on the census, and more potentially that you can use. And it's been used as well, not just academically, but by government. So LS-based analysis has been used in a variety of landmark government reviews, looking into inequalities in health, with the Inequalities in Health, the Black Report, the Whitehead Report, the Aitchison Report in 1998. Similarly with the Pensions Review in 2004, Fair Funding, the Donut Report in 2011. So this all kind of, the LS can always feed into useful, impactful government research as well. And we're currently working with a new project potentially from the Cabinet Office to work out how the LS can feed into their State of the Nation publications, similarly looking at inequalities in health specifically. So hopefully that's given you a good idea of what the LS is and what it has been used for and what it can be used for. I'm going to hand over to Stephen now to carry on with the presentation. Thank you, Stephen.
Brilliant. Thanks, Adam. Brilliant. Great. So thank you, Adam, and thank you to Emma and the sort of wider SRS team for both the award, the Research Excellence Award, and being able to come and present to you guys today to talk about what specifically Celsius does in relation to support for the ONS Longitudinal Study. So as was introduced at the start, my name is Stephen Jivraj. I'm a Professor of Quantitative Social Science at University College London, and I head up this project called the Centre for Longitudinal Study Information and User Support, which more better known as Celsius. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is just talk a little bit about what we do at Celsius to support users of the ONS Longitudinal Study and give you a flavour of some of the more recent work that we've had published and that we're doing ourselves. So firstly, what is this thing called Celsius? As you probably see from the branding on my slides, I'm based at UCL, and this project called Celsius is based at UCL. And the project Celsius has been based at UCL since about 2012. And during most of that time, it was led by a colleague of mine, Nicola Shelton, and I took over the project about 18 months ago. But there's been this long history of providing project support for the ONS Longitudinal Study to the academic community through academic institutions. And I think Adam and all the sort of predecessors who have worked in the ONS side of the ONS development team would sort of agree that us being within a university, actually being closer to the typical users of the ONS Longitudinal Study is somewhat of an asset, and we really do complement each other. Adam's team does fantastic work on preparing the data and helping to some extent with project support, sometimes in collaboration with Celsius, other times doing it directly themselves, particularly with government researchers like the ones that Adam just previously described, based in the Cabinet Office. But us being based at UCL is a real asset for us because, like I say, it brings us closer to particularly the academic users who use these data. We're funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, and the majority of that funding goes on salaries for what we call our user support officers. Their names listed on the slide there: Yitka Pekartova, Alison Sizer, and Jemima Stockton. They are the absolute engine room of what is Celsius. In fact, they keep the show on the road. I just have the fortunate job of being a bit of the face of it and coming to events like this. So they know much more about the operation than I do, and they carry out the operation. So they're the people who do the real hard work. And what they do is help users through an entire project life cycle. So I just briefly describe some of the points in which people go through in terms of using the ONS Longitudinal Study. So in the first instance, people hear about it, maybe at an event like this, and think that these data might be of use to them. And so they might make an inquiry to Celsius using the email address you can see on the screen there. And what we do, and when I say we, the user support officers, liaise with those people and give them advice on whether the ONS Longitudinal Study is an appropriate data resource for them to use. Once we've kind of made the agreement that perhaps this data could be of use to individuals who make those inquiries, we then help users make an application. And the application process is a little bit more rigorous than it might be to use most other data set that people might be familiar with, in the sense that people need to make an application to use the ONS Longitudinal Study, but they also need to become accredited researcher to use the secure research service that Emma was describing earlier on, which the LS is deposited within. And so in collaboration with Adam's team, the people at Celsius help the users navigate that process of making those applications and getting approval to access the data. Once that's all complete, then we're in the process of creating extracts for the data. So unlike data that perhaps you might have used before, maybe open access data or maybe safeguarded data from somewhere like the UK Data Service, what we don't provide to users is the full LS database. When a researcher applies to use the data, we create them a custom data set with variables that relate to the project that they're interested in. And that's for a number of reasons, but largely to ensure the confidentiality and the disclosure of the LS birth dates isn't compromised in any way, shape, or form. And then once that data extract has been created for the user and they do their research within the secure research themselves or with support from our user support officers, then the next stage in the project lifecycle is typically people producing outputs from research and getting those outputs approved that they take out of the secure research service. And again, in collaboration with Adam's team, the Celsius user support officers do that job of ensuring that the outputs that people are producing don't again compromise any anonymity of the data and can be used outside that environment. So that's essentially what Celsius is. What I just want to do briefly next is just talk not really specifically about projects that we've supported, but just building on what Adam said before in relation to why the ONS longitudinal study is such a great resource for researchers. As Adam sort of alluded to, one of the real unique features is the size of the data. And what that enables is people to look at groups in society which are often underrepresented in large-scale national social surveys, for example. So many large-scale national social surveys probably have around 10,000 people, whether that be a cross-sectional survey or a longitudinal survey. Probably in each data collection, roughly, I'm thinking of something like the Health Survey for England has about 10,000 people. Even the largest nationally representative cohort study that people might be familiar with in the sense of understanding society, again, doesn't have anything like the sample size of the LS. And so when you want to do analysis of particular groups in society who might be unrepresented in those data sets, just in terms of numbers, not in terms of any bias in terms of them being sampled into the data, but I'm thinking here of particular ethnic minority groups, perhaps, as Adam described, particular occupational groups. Perhaps you were looking at an outcome which is quite rare. So there's an example there on the slide of people looking at colorectal cancer incidence, of quite uncommon with the entire population. So if you're interested in these groups who aren't large in number in large-scale social surveys, the LS is a fantastic resource with which to be able to research those kind of population and those kind of groups because of our large sample size. Also, as Adam described, ONS longitudinal study has been going on for a long time now. We've got 50 years of linked census data. So although the data perhaps doesn't go quite far in back as time as some of the crown jewels, as often described in social science research, the British birth cohort studies, which the earliest which goes back to 1946. So although our data doesn't go as quite far back in time of those studies, one of the advantages of using the ONS longitudinal study over things like the birth cohort studies, which are so highly regarded and are fantastic data resources, which I've used a lot myself, is that the ONS longitudinal study doesn't suffer from respondent non-response attrition in the same way that those do. Given the way that Adam described the data, nobody knows whether they're in the ONS longitudinal study, so you can't remove yourself from it. The only way in which you can leave the study is either to leave the country or to die. There is a case where maybe you might not complete a census record, and in that case, we wouldn't have linked census data for you. But it's almost certain that almost every individual in England and Wales who has a birthday of one of the LS respondents, that would still collect some data from you in terms of life events that you've had. So it's very hard to escape from the ONS longitudinal study if you should be part of it. So we don't have that problem of attrition, which is, like I say, very common in the birth cohort studies, which, if you look at the most recent data collections of those, most have halved in size over the period. Thinking of the British birth cohort study, National Child Development Study, and the 1946 birth cohort study, they've halved in size in terms of their responses. That's not something that happens with the ONS longitudinal study. So we don't have that same attrition bias, which enables us to do the kind of research of the examples you can see on the slide there. And all of those words written on the slide are published outputs using LS research, which has been supported by Celsius. So if you use any of those words to search those studies, you should be able to find the published outputs. I just want to end by talking about some research that I'm doing myself as actually a user of the ONS longitudinal study, using the very recently 2021 linked data. And this is on national identity, which again, Adam picked up before about this idea of looking at how people's national identities have changed over time. And so what you can see on the slide there are, I'll just first tell you about how national identity is recorded in the census, in the sense that it was first included in 2011, where people were asked to describe just simply, what is your national identity? And there were response categories for each of the constituent countries in the UK. So if living in England, you could say your national identity was English, Welsh, Scottish, Northern Irish, or you could say your national identity was something else. And there was another category, which then you were encouraged to describe in words what that national identity was. In 2011, the response categories were such that English was the first response category. Things changed between 2011 and 2021 in that on the census form in England, the response category that came first was actually British. And so there's a bit of a change in terms of how the data were collected in the different time points. What you see here on the slide is data just for England from the ONS Longitudinal Study of people who have linked records between 2011 and 2021 who provided national identity information at both censuses. And so what you can see here is that in 2011, most people in England reported their national identity as only English. And by 2021, you can see that most people describe their national identity as only British. Now, what I'm showing you here could actually be shown using aggregate census data, which is openly available through many sources. NOMIS is the one I tend to use. And so I'm not really showing you anything really unique here. But what the ONS longitudinal study enables you to do is look at those linked records and potentially look at transitions. And so that's one of the advantages. You can see how people change their characteristics from one census to another. And that's what you can see in the Sankey chart here. So what we've got here, this is produced by my colleague at Queen's University Belfast, a person called Momomo Nishikido, who's working with me on a separate funded ESRC project. And what we see here are on the left side, people as they reported their national identity in 2011, and on the right side, how they changed, if they did at all, their national identity by 2021. So again here, this is people just in England who reported a national identity at both censuses. And what's interesting is what we can see is the majority of people who reported English national identity in 2011 reported a British-only national identity in 2021. Now, I think probably the main driver for this is the reordering of the response categories. The evidence I give for that is that it's, I think, quite a peculiar change. I mean, given what happened in the period 2011 to 2021, I don't think we'd expect people who prior reported their English as their national identity, as English, would transition to British. If anything, given the events that happened during that time period, you would probably expect more of the opposite, people transitioning probably from British to English, if anything. So I think the response categories probably have had a really big impact on how people report their national identity. I think potentially this also sort of speaks to something that people are probably a bit fickle about this thing called national identity. For many people, it probably doesn't have a very strong resonance. And they maybe, I think these data potentially present an argument that many people are comfortable describing themselves as English on one day and British on another. And it doesn't really matter which they ascribe to. But one thing that we've looked at, which we think has sort of substance to what we can study in terms of the transition, is the green category on the bottom left-hand corner of the Sankey chart there. So they're the people who didn't report any form of British national identity in 2011. So they didn't say they were English, British, or any combination of any UK identity. So these are people who reported essentially some foreign identity in 2011. What you can see there from the Sankey chart is almost half, not quite half, but almost half of those people actually transitioned into some form of British, and in fact, most of them to a British-only identity in 2021. And so this is really interesting because if we think back to why national identity was included in the census in 2011 was to see how, as a country, how much we're ascribing to particularly British national identity. And I think in part, the inclusion of the question in the 2011 census was to look at those groups who perhaps people think are not ascribing to a British national identity, how they report this thing called national identity. And what's really interesting here is those people that transitioned from a non-British national identity in 2011 to 2021. In fact, if we look at the predictors of that, which I'm not going to show you here on the screen, but just describe to you in words, is actually, it's those groups who are typically considered as not having a strong British national identity previously. So here, if we're looking particularly at the Muslim ethnic groups, so particularly the Bangladeshi group, in fact, the Bangladeshi group is the most likely of all the ethnic minority groups to make that transition from a non-British identity in 2011 to a British national identity in 2021. And so I think that's really interesting that these transitions are of people who actually are the ones in which we think are well, I think the politicians who I think lobbied for the inclusion of this in question on the census in 2011. It's the groups who are perhaps considered least British who are actually making that transition. And those groups who perhaps we're less worried about are not making that transition to a British national identity. That concludes everything